Good afternoon. Hope everyone's enjoying Tech Ed so far. Almost done. Big party tomorrow. All right, save your energy up. My name's Stephen Barron. I'm a program manager in the Virtual Machine Manager team. I want to thank you ahead of time for attending Modeling and Maintaining Virtualized Services in VMM 2012. As you'll see, we've made a number of investments in services in VMM. It's a new concept. We've also extended what we do with VM templates. We uncover things like app deployment, scale out, scale in, the notion of a service, so we're going to go into all that. This is a 300-level session, so it will be somewhat technical. We'll go somewhat deep into some of the areas. I'll leave enough time for questions. If you have some questions as we're going through, we can take those as they come up. If it becomes too many, I may structure it a little bit, but we'll try to take questions in stride. So essentially, when you leave here, and I guess I should get some context first, how many folks are familiar with VMM 2008 R2? Great. And how many folks have downloaded the VMM 2012 beta? Okay, great. So when you leave the session, for those of you who haven't downloaded the beta, I hope it's going to incent you to want to download the beta. For those of you who have, I hope it'll give you a jump start on getting going with services. And as you'll see, irrespective of whether or not you want to embrace application deployment straight away with VMM 2012, there's still a lot of benefits that go along with taking your VMs and wrapping them inside of a service template, transitioning them to a service. And it's as simple as that. You can take any of your existing VM templates, put them into a service template, and you gain some benefits from us right off the bat, whether or not you're doing advanced features like application deployment. So we'll provide an overview of the service management lifecycle inside of VMM, how you create a service, how you deploy that service, how you configure the service, and how you update the service over time. I'll do a bunch of demos throughout the session in terms of creating service templates, deploying, updating. How many folks also use Operations Manager in their environment? So we've also increased our investment in our Operations Manager integration, so I'll show you some of the new things we've done there and how we translate your services into Operations Manager as diagrams and how we seamlessly update those diagrams when you change the service inside of VMM. And I think what you're going to find by the end of the session is that if you do embrace services, either for standard VM templates that you have today, or especially with some of the new advanced features that we bring in, that it's really going to increase the repeatability, the predictability, the reliability of deploying VMs, services, and applications throughout your various environments. So if you've been to other VMM sessions, you've probably seen this slide. Essentially, we've made a lot of investments across the product, from the deployments we support to the Fabric investments, introducing support for Citrix Zen Server, introducing new concepts around dynamic optimization, power optimization, so you can balance your clusters, you can power off nodes according to your schedule when they're not in use. We've introduced this big abstraction called the cloud. I'm sure you've heard the term a few times, where we abstract what your self-service users see from the underlying fabric. And the cloud's not the only abstraction you provided. If you attended yesterday's VMM session on networking and storage, what we've also done is provide abstractions around networking and storage so that your self-service users, the folks deploying VMs, deploying applications, and managing them, they don't have to be concerned with the underlying fabric. Which host is it going to? What's the actual IP address I need? What's the actual SAN that I should have my VHD or VMDK deployed to? We allow you to create these simple, user-friendly abstractions where a logical network could be called front end. So the end user knows that their application or this tier of an application has to be internet-facing. But they don't know which IP address it should have, which subnet it should be on, which VLAN. They just choose a friendly name like Internet Network. For storage, they don't know that it has to be on an HP EVA or an EMC EVA or a NetApp device. They just know that their SQL tier needs fast storage, and their web tier can deal with slower storage because it costs them less. So you can create classifications and say, you choose the storage for each individual disk of your VM or your service, and tell us if you need fast storage, gold storage, silver storage. It's all up to you to define those classifications. The last big investment we've made is all around services. So we have a new template type, and we have several new profile types that we'll go into over the course of the next hour or so. We've enabled application deployment. So when we looked at VMM 2008 R2, when we looked at the state of virtualization, it seems like deploying a VM with a base OS is pretty much a well-understood problem with lots and lots of solutions out there. Chief amongst them, VMM 2008 R2. But how many servers, I would ask, do you have running throughout your environments that have a base OS and nothing else installed on them. If you look at Server 2008 R2, you couldn't even have a file server without enabling the file server role. So what's important about the VMs is not the base OS. What's more important is the applications that are running inside those VMs, right? That's what's delivering the services out to your business. And when we also look at virtual machines and we look at services being delivered to the business, generally, you don't take an application or a service and install everything on one VM, right? You have a web tier that has an IIS site, for example, with the user interface. You may have a middle tier that does some business logic, some app processing. And you probably have a data tier. And generally, those are spread across multiple machines. Your data tier is maybe a standalone SQL server, maybe it's virtualized, or maybe it's a SQL cluster, and it's physical out in the environment. And it hosts databases for lots and lots of applications, lots and lots of services. Your web tier is probably a little bit lighter in terms of the hardware requirements, but you compensate for that by putting them behind a load balancer, so they're highly available. And you can add more as you need. And your mid-tier may or may not be scale out, right? But the point is, the service that's being delivered, say an HR application, is not all on one server. It has lots of servers that contribute to providing that service out to your end users. And that's what we've done with the service template, with application deployment, and with some other features like custom command execution, which we'll go into, which allow you to not only spin up VMs and collections of VMs that we call a service, but also deploy applications directly inside those VMs, enable roles and features, all sorts of great investments that we've made. And we're going to cover all of those today. So that's where we're going to focus for this session. So the other investments that we've made across the platform, lots of sessions around VMM, some yesterday. There's another one after this one. I think there's a couple more tomorrow. If you didn't get to attend any of them, or if you have some other conflicts, clearly check out the other decks. And hopefully at some point when you get the DVD, the videos, watch the other sessions. It really feels to me, being on the team for a while, like a V1 product. It doesn't feel like just the next release of VMM. I almost wish we would have changed the name of it, because it does a lot more than just virtual machine management nowadays. So services in VMM, what are they? Most of you indicated that you're familiar with VMM 2008 R2, so you're familiar with virtual machine templates. And what we had in 2008 R2 was a VM template which defined a couple things. It defined a hardware configuration, how much memory is my VM getting, how many processors am I assigning to it, what's the network configuration, and it had an OS profile, right, an OS configuration, where you could do some basic operations on that VM. What's the computer name going to be? What's the local administrator password? Is it going to be domain joined? And if so, which credentials am I going to use to join it to the domain? Does it have a product key? All those sorts of things. So that template is still alive and well in VMM 2012, and again, it's actually the foundation for service templates. But we've introduced a service template, which enables you, again, to add other types of profiles to the template. So the guest OS profile has been extended with role and feature support for Windows 2008 R2. So using a service, you can actually install roles and features inside of a VM. It's also been extended with an application profile, which allows you to install certain types of applications. And it's been extended with SQL profiles. So we'll actually do deployments of SQL servers into the environment, assuming they're going to be virtualized. So we'll deploy the VM, we'll install SQL Server, and we'll configure it according to your specifications. And that also includes reporting services, and we'll go into that in some of the demos. So the template is always a starting point for your service. It's always a source of truth. And this is a fundamental difference between VMM 2008 R2 virtual machine templates, and I'm going to harp on this over the course of the session because it's a really important concept for you to walk away understanding. When you deployed a VM in VMM 2008 R2, it was a fire and forget operation. And what I mean by that was, if you took a VM template and deployed 10 instances, right, so 10 VMs from that one template, none of those deployed instances ever maintained a reference back to the template from which they were deployed. So if you made changes to the template, there was no way to cascade those changes or enforce those changes on VMs that had been deployed. Now, that's the same behavior in VMM 2012 for virtual machine templates. But once you start leveraging service templates, when you deploy an instance of a service from a template, that instance does maintain a reference back to the template from which it was deployed. What that means is you can't modify a service template if it has running instances. What it gives you, however, is the ability to copy that service template, give it a new version, a new release, make some changes to it, go find the instances that reference the first version, the previous version, point them to the new version of the template, and we can detect the changes that have been put in place, allow you to apply those changes immediately, or allow you to defer those changes so that you can apply them during a maintenance window. The next question I usually get is, well, what kinds of changes? They could be hardware changes. So maybe I had a standard web server template, I wrapped it inside of a server template, and I gave it 2 gigs of memory. And it turns out that almost all my web applications actually need 4 gigs of memory on that VM. I can go back to the template, copy it, give it a version, say 2.0, modify the hardware config so that those VMs have 4 gigs of memory, get a list of all the running instances that happen to be out there that are pointed to version 1.0, set them to use the version 2.0, or set some subset of them. It doesn't have to be all. I may test it on one of the instances, hit apply, and again, choose to either apply it immediately or defer it to a maintenance window. And what we'll do is take those changes and apply it. So in this case, we'd stop the machine, give it 4 gigs of memory, restart it. Maybe I have a less intrusive change. Maybe I, again, created a standard web server template, and I gave it the IIS web role, and I gave it the application server role. And I went out and deployed 80 instances of this web server, or my self-service users deployed 80 instances of web servers based off of this template. And it turns out that 90% of my applications that are running on those web servers require the IIS 6 management compatibility role. And I didn't enable that on those servers. So in the old days, my choice was to script the install maybe across 80 instances, or touch all 80 instances individually and enable the role, tell my users, well, you're going to have to go enable the role. What I could do with VMM 2012 is copy that service template, give it a new version, enable the IIS 6 management role, knowing that that is a non-intrusive change that doesn't require a reboot or a restart of any services. I choose to set all the running instances to the new version of the template, and a few seconds later, they're all going to have the IIS 6 management compatibility role enabled on them. So I didn't have to touch a single machine. I have a new version of the template, and if I deploy a new VM from that version 2.0, it's going to get all the roles and features, including the IIS 6 management compatibility feature. Question?
Yeah, what about OS patches and service packs?
So the question was OS patches and service packs. So we have some solutions for that in terms of being able to patch your OS and not disrupt the running applications, and we'll talk about that when we get to 2 types of servicing that we have. One is called conventional, one's called image-based, and we'll have a demo of that as well. So I'll just defer the answer to the question until we get to that portion. So we talked about this. Again, the template is the starting point of truth, and then your instances are what's actually running out in the environment. We talked a little bit about some new features around app deployment. So what we support as first-class application deployment technologies are Microsoft Web Deploy, so the Web Deploy toolkit for IIS applications, Server App V. Anyone get a chance to go to the Server App V session this morning? Okay, so Server App V, if you're familiar with Client App V, this is Server App V, so it includes support for some additional subsystems that are common to server-based apps, like Windows Services, the IIS subsystem, COM, DCOM, and so forth. If you didn't get a chance to see that session, highly recommend watching it on the DVD, checking out the slides. Great technology. And for database applications, we support SQL DAC. And the interesting thing about our support for SQL DAC is it doesn't have to be a virtualized SQL server to which we're deploying. It doesn't even have to be a SQL server that's managed by VMM. We have a concept, and we'll go over this in the demos, of an application host. And for VMM 2012, the only type of application host we have is a SQL Server application host. This could be a physical SQL server, a physical SQL cluster running out in the environment, and we can deploy those database applications to that cluster. So a lot of times when we talk to larger customers, again, they may have a SQL server that hosts databases for multiple applications. You could deploy your web tier via SCVMM, where we're going to install the web deploy into the VM, but the database that's used by that service, we're actually going to go ahead and deploy to a physical SQL server out in the environment. Now, when I say we have support for these as first-class application deployment technologies, it doesn't mean it's the only thing that we can deploy. What I mean by first class is we actually understand these package formats. So when we import an SAV package from our library, when we refresh a web deploy package that's been copied to our library, we understand the properties and the metadata of those packages, so we can expose configurable settings. So I could have a single SAV package or a single web deploy package, and maybe I have a configurable setting for my connection string. And I can take that package, put it in a single service template, and mark that setting, say my connection string, for example, as a configurable service setting that must be filled in by the user prior to deployment. I could provide a default value if I want. And now I can take that single service template and that single application package and deploy it into my dev environment, my QA environment, my production environment. And every time I deploy, the only thing I'm changing at deployment time is I'm specifying the connection string. Because most likely in dev, I'm connecting to a dev SQL server. In staging, I'm connected to a different SQL server, maybe even a different database name. And in production, again, yet a third SQL server. We do have support for what I mentioned real briefly on the first screen for custom command execution or generic command execution. And this framework serves a few purposes. One, it allows you to run scripts or run pretty much any executable before any applications are installed on a VM, after all the applications have been installed. It allows you to also run scripts pre and post individual application installation. So if I'm deploying a web deploy application, I need the web deploy framework on that server. So before deploying the application, I can specify that I want to run a script that goes ahead and installs the web deploy framework. And after installation, I may run a script to configure that web tier. Or maybe it requires an IIS reset. So I could build that in as a post-install script. What you can also do with generic command execution, though, is any type of setup that you have, whether it be, say, an MSI or a custom setup executable that you've developed, you could deploy that through VMM by using generic command execution as long as it can run unattended and silently. And we'll go ahead and run those commands inside the VM. I'll show you an example of a generic command execution script I have that installs the .NET framework because I know it's required for an application that I'm deploying. And that's just an executable. So again, I was able to leverage this framework we provided to install an application type that's not considered, say, a first-class application deployment technology from a VMM perspective. Question?
So using the MSI, can that be tied in with SCCM and OSD to be able to layer installation packages in addition to this, or is it tied in with the server app only?
So you could use SCCM, I imagine, to deploy a web deploy package, but there would really be no tie-in between what VMM is doing and what SCCM is doing. So we would probably look to VMM to be your server application deployment technology, especially in your virtualized environments. This isn't going to apply to physical servers outside of that SQL application host that I spoke about. But for your virtualized servers, we would expect that you would do your application deployment, your server application deployment via VMM, where we understand those packages. Another question?
Why is it different? I mean, it's the same software, right? Whether I deploy on a physical machine or a virtual machine, what should I use?
Yeah, so again, it's a matter of scope. Right, it's a matter of time and resources, and the only thing we could tackle was the virtualized infrastructure right now within VMM. So is the question, why isn't Config Manager doing this?
Right. It's doing it, right? Config Manager, SCCM is doing it.
Right, so Config Manager can deploy packages. I don't think they have the support or the knowledge about these particular application packages to allow these configurable settings like we expose them. And I think when you see the demo, you'll understand what I'm talking about with the configurable service settings for web deploy, server app V, and so forth. So why would you use services? I think I gave a number of reasons. One is to maintain that relationship between a deployed instance and the template from which it was deployed. And not just the template, but the template version from which it was deployed. So you have a good inventory of what those machines should look like, and you have a good mechanism for updating them. And just as important, maybe rolling back in case a package update didn't go as well as planned or there was a problem with a package. This enables scale out. So a service is comprised of one or more tiers. So in a typical 3-tier application, I would have, say, a web tier. That's a scale out tier. A mid tier that may or may not be a scale out tier. And a data tier that's probably not a scale out tier. Right? The high availability for that is probably handled via clustering. And also, if you think about the way you maintain images today, lots of customers we talk to have a sysprepped image for a web server that has roles features baked in some particular configuration. Maybe a sysprepped image for a DHCP server, a sysprepped image for an application server. And those images are big, right? And they're not the easiest things to maintain over time. What you could do if you leverage services is have one sysprepped image, which is, say, a base 2008 R2 image. It has no roles and features. It has no configuration performed to it. And you can offload the configuration of that into our templates, which are just database objects and consume very little space. And all that space is just consumed in the database because it's just metadata. You're just telling us after the OS is installed, which is important, do the more important things, or just as important, configure the roles and features for my web server, or configure the roles and features for my application server, or configure applications for this particular type of server that's running on a standard web server. So it will allow you to maintain far fewer images in the long run than you're probably maintaining today. So the lifecycle management of a service, we'll walk through this in the demo, which we're going to switch over to pretty shortly, is you create a template, and we'll walk through template creation. You customize the deployment, and what I mean by that is those configurable service settings that tailor a particular deployment to a particular environment, you do that at deployment time. So I may have a setting, again, for connection string, or I may have to provide a user account that a Windows service is going to run under. Anything that makes that deployment particular to a particular environment and a specific purpose. At deployment time, the end user goes ahead and customizes the deployment. The service is actually deployed, up and running in the environment, and then at some point, more than likely, you're going to have to update the service. Maybe it's a new package of the web deploy IIS site. Maybe it's a new version of the SAV package. Maybe a new version of the database. So updating that, again, we spoke about a couple times, is a matter of copying the template, giving it a new version, and setting the running instance to the new version of the template. And you don't always just go forward. You can go backwards. You can skip versions, so a lot of leeway there. Question?
So ultimately, you would have a service that would be your dev, a service that you're staging, and because they have unique settings based on, they're probably different domains at a minimum.
Yes. So the question was, you have multiple services because you have one in dev and one in QA, and they're in different domains, they have different settings, right, different connection strings. You have multiple instances of a service, but you have one service template that they all reference. So the only thing that gets customized is the settings for that instance at deployment time. But you know that the application package used for installation is the same across all of them. You know all the settings that are not marked as configurable. The local administrator password, the OS product key, right? Anything that you've not marked configurable, you know that that's identical across all the environments. So you get a level of repeatability, reliability, and predictability in terms of the deployment. So I think we went over this. Again, we still have hardware profiles and OS profiles like we had in 2008 R2. A service template uses those and then introduces new profile types, so application profiles, SQL profiles. Deployed services always link to their templates. I think that's the 5th time I mentioned it. It won't be the last. And typically information like physical host or particular load balancers. And what I mean by a particular load balancer is a specific, say, F5 device in the environment or a specific IP address of a Citrix NetScaler in the environment. Typically, that's not available when you're creating the template. So we use these constructs like a VIP template if you went to the session yesterday on storage and networking, or storage classifications. So the template author can specify this tier needs to be behind a load balancer, and that load balancer needs to be configured for persistent HTTPS traffic, and it should terminate the SSL connection and not reestablish it when it talks to the web server. So they don't specify, I need this particular big IP F5 device. They just specify the characteristics they need of the load balancer, choose the VIP template that satisfies those characteristics, and we'll find the right load balancer at deployment time. Similarly for storage, they just say, again, my SQL server needs gold storage, but my web server needs bronze storage. We'll find the right storage arrays based on the classifications that the administrator has set up and expose those to the end user, and we'll make sure that the VHDs get placed to the proper type of storage. So this is our service designer. I'm going to skip this because we're going to jump into the demo. We have the ribbon. So all the System Center products moving to the ribbon. We have it in the designer. You have a canvas where you drag and configure VM templates, and then tier properties down at the bottom where you define the properties of a particular tier. Is it a scale-out tier? What's its deployment order? What's its servicing order? We're going to go into this in depth once I fire up the demo. So again, there are benefits to taking your existing VM templates and putting them in a service template straight away, whether you're leveraging any of the features particular to services or not. So even if you're not leveraging role and feature, even if you're not leveraging app deployment, this will set you up to leverage them in the future. And the process is simply taking an existing VM template, putting it in a service template, and that's it. You don't deploy the VM template any longer. You deploy the service template. And then if you decide to take advantage of roles and features later, if you decide to add applications into that service template, then you can deploy multiple instances of that, and you know that they're all going to look identical, and you're going to be able to take advantage of some of the new features. So you can't take an existing VM that's out there running or a VM that you've deployed from a VM template and turn it into a service. So that's why I recommend if you're creating new VM templates, don't allow users or don't yourself deploy a VM template. Always wrap that VM template in a service template, and it will sort of future-proof you as you start taking advantage of the new features that we've brought into the product. How do you take a VM template and put it in a service template? I think after this screen, I'm going to jump into the demo, and that will definitely answer the question.
Does wrapping it in a service take less time than creating a regular VM template?
So a service template always uses VM templates inside of it, either an existing one, or you can create a new one from the service designer.
Does it take less time? Before, to roll it out,
It should take an identical amount of time. If you're simply taking a VM template, leveraging no new features of service templates, it should be the exact same amount of time. So this screen is going to get a little busy. I just want to warn you ahead of time, but it's not as complicated as it looks. I just want to outline all the new objects that we have up front before we jump into the demo machine, where hopefully that demo will reinforce these. Quick question?
just quick. Unfortunately, I found myself still rolling out 2003 service. I know it's 2011, right? Do we get any of this good news?
Yes. So server roles and features, only supported in Server 2008 R2. Clearly, roles and features aren't even available in 2003. All the application deployment technologies, all the service template and instance references apply to Server 2003 SP2 and above. So if you want to deploy web deploy, if you want to deploy server app V, you can deploy those out to Server 2003 SP2 and above. So you're all familiar with these. These are objects that we have existing in VMM 2008 R2. So what we've done is we've added a computer tier object. And these are part of a service template. So I have a standard VM template, but a service template introduces a computer tier. And you can have one or more of those. So you could have a web tier, a mid tier, and a data tier. That's part of the service template. In addition, in the VM template, we've included support for what we call application profiles. This is where you specify web deploy packages, SAV packages, SQL DAC databases to be installed. We have application deployments. So an application profile, one profile, could contain 2 web deploy packages, 3 SAV packages, and 6 databases. You're not limited to one application deployment per profile. So you can have multiple applications being deployed by one profile. And then we have GCEs. These are optional. This is if you want to install something again before any application is installed or before a particular application is installed, after all applications are installed, or after a particular application is installed. We have roles and features in the guest OS profile, and if you have the operating system of your profile set to say Server 2008 R2, you select some roles and features, and then you turn out and say, oh, actually this template was supposed to be for Server 2003, we'll warn you that you're going to a OS version that that precludes this feature, and we'll go ahead and remove the roles and features after giving you a warning and asking you to confirm. We have a SQL profile. This allows us to deploy SQL servers into the environment. This is for SQL Server 2008 R2 and later, because that was the first version of SQL that supported sysprepping. So essentially what you have is a sysprep version of SQL, and then we're going to install that and do the post-sysprep configuration, setting up the service accounts per your standards, enabling TCP/IP or named pipes, specifying the initial administrators, what's the SQL authentication mode, is it mixed or Windows, what's the SA admin password if it's mixed, and so forth. Then we have SQL deployments, so I could actually deploy multiple instances of SQL Server on one server, right? So I could have SQL instance support. I don't have to deploy just one instance, I can actually deploy multiple. We have a load balancer template, which is linked to a computer tier. So in my service template designer, I can take my web tier, for example, and say, this tier is actually behind a load balancer. And then I need to select the template, which defines the type of load balancing my application requires. Persistent HTTP, non-persistent HTTPS, what have you. We have an application host profile. This is only for SQL databases and SQL scripts, and this allows us to deploy databases to existing SQL servers, whether they're managed by VMM or not, and whether they're physical or not. Question?
Usually those computers that are behind the load balancer are on a different either IP range or subnet. Are you able to?
Yes. Yeah, so the question was, usually the web servers or any server behind a load balancer is on a different subnet than the load balancer is itself, right? So I have a VIP, which is my forward-facing IP address. I have DIPS, behind, which facilitate the communication between the back end of the load balancer and the machines behind that load balancer. We won't necessarily verify the connectivity between those two, but we do allow you to specify which IP pool, for example, my VIPs come from, and which IP pool or pools my DIPs come from. So your forward-facing VIP pool may be a 167 address, and your backward-facing DIP pool may be a 10.0 address, right? Fully supported. For application hosts, we do have an application profile, but again, since application host in this version is specific to SQL databases, the only artifacts allowed in an application profile for an application host are SQL databases and SQL scripts. You can't run GCEs, you can't try to install a web deploy, only SQL databases and only SQL scripts. And then we have SQL DAC deployment that goes along with that. And then we have settings, and these are the settings I've spoken about a few times that allow you to define which settings of this package, which setting of this deployment should be configurable by the end user. Is it mandatory or not? Is it an encrypted setting? And am I going to provide them a default value or not? So we've covered a lot of the customization. I want to get up to the demo screen. Actually, I'll switch over to the demo now, and then we'll come back to, well, let me cover this one real quick. So when we go ahead and deploy a service, let's assume it has multiple tiers. I'm allowed to specify in the service designer, in the service template, what's my deployment order per tier. So if I have a typical 3-tier application with a web front end, a middle tier with some business logic, and a SQL data tier, I probably want my database up first. I then want my middle tier logic up second, and I want my web tier up last, because it needs the other two components in place before the service can actually function. So we'll select the tier based on the deployment order. And to be clear, we deploy all the VMs in parallel. The deployment order simply tells us how should the applications be installed within the tiers. So if I had a 5 VM service, 1 data, 2 mid-tier, and 2 front-end, we'd spin all the VMs up in parallel, and then we would do the SQL application deployment, the mid-tier deployment, and the web deployment. So we've selected the tier. We're going to create a new VM from that template for that tier. We're going to power it on and wait. Once the VM's powered on, we inject a guest agent inside the VM, and that's what allows us to do initial application deployment and ongoing servicing of that VM. Once that's done, the generic command execution, the ones that are yellow on the screen, are purely optional. You may choose to use them, you may choose not to. At a minimum, you're going to have an application to be installed, though. So the application will be installed. And again, the generic command execution is really provided as a framework for you to execute scripts before or after application install. Once that's done, if applicable, we're going to add that VM to the load balancer. And we're done with that tier, and we're going to move on to the next tier for application deployment purposes. So now we can jump into the demo, the first demo. And I'll start off in my library view, and you'll see we have support again for a number of new types of profiles and a new template type, which is our service template. You'll see in the system right now I have a number of VM templates. These are standard virtual machine templates that I created with the idea that I'd add them to a service template. So I'm going to walk through the creation of a pet shop service. And just for reference, if anyone's not familiar, pet shop is this reference.NET application that Microsoft puts out and updates from time to time that leverages a lot of different technologies. So it has a SQL database backend, it has an IIS website, and it also has, uses message queuing, and it uses a service to queue up requests that come from the web tier. So I'm going to design a 3-tier service using Pet Shop so that I can go ahead and deploy it, and then we'll update it in a later demo. So it allows you to go in and look at fish and add them to shopping carts and all that good stuff. So I have these VM templates, and if I go to my service templates view, I have a number of them already, but I'll go ahead, right-click, and create a new service template. The first thing that happens is I get to choose a service template pattern. So when I create a service template, I can actually mark it as a pattern after the fact, and I'll show you the property that does that. And if I did that, it means maybe I have a standard type of 2-tier application that requires connectivity to a load balancer. All my applications of this type use persistent HTTPS, for example. I could create that service template, mark it as a pattern, and when I came back into start a new service template, I'd be given that choice on this screen. So instead of just having blank, I may have blank or standard Contoso 2-tier web application. So you can create your own service templates, mark them as patterns, and allow users to get jump-started in creating their own. So I'll start off with a blank one here, and you see all the VM templates that I have in my system are here. If it turns out that I'm creating a brand new VM template, I have an option right up here to kick off the VM template wizard, which will create a new VM template and automatically add it to the service. But if I have my existing VM templates that are ready to go, it's just a matter of dragging and dropping them onto the canvas. So my web server has an IIS site that's going to be deployed to it along with a script, and I'll open up a couple of these so you can see the properties of them. My mid-tier server, the queuing service, the message queuing service, I actually packaged up using Server App V. So this is a Server App V package in this tier. And then my SQL server is going to do a couple things. First, you'll notice at the bottom this SQL Server deployment. So it's going to spin up a VM. It's going to install SQL Server for me. It's going to configure it per my specifications. And then it's going to install 4 databases. So my master pet shop database, the orders database, profile, and services. And then it's going to run a post-installation configuration script to seed that database with some data, make sure I have the right SQL users in place, and any other post-installation configuration I have to perform. So if I look at the pet shop tier, first I want to highlight the properties of the tier. And at the bottom, you'll see this tier. Since it's a web tier, I would say, you know, this tier really should be a scale-out tier. And when I deploy an instance of this, by default, I want to make sure that there's 2 web servers available in that tier. And I want to make sure that it's a maximum of 6. I don't want people scaling out to 20 instances in that tier. And I want to make sure that it has a minimum instance count of 2. I never want it to drop below its default. I could configure it with a default of 4 and a minimum of 2 to allow it to scale in a little more. And then I can say how many upgrade domains this tier has. Now, upgrade domains are a mechanism to allow us to do upgrades and updates to services without causing any downtime if you have multiple instances. Windows Azure has this concept, and that's why we chose the term upgrade domains, because we treat it pretty much identically. So if I have 2 instances in this tier, and I mark that I should have 2 upgrade domains, what we do is take the number of running instances, divide it by the number of upgrades domains you've specified, and that's how many servers will service at one point in time. So if I had 4 instances running and 2 upgrade domains, and now I'm performing an update, we take the 4 instances divided by the 2 upgrade domains. We'll take 2 of those servers out of the load balancer, do the upgrade on them, put them back into the load balancer, and move on to the next 2. So the application could be serviced with no downtime to end users whatsoever. I can also specify deployment order and servicing order. So my web tier would probably be deployed third. My SQL tier would probably be deployed first. And my mid-tier, I'd probably choose a deployment order of 2 for that. And I'd go through the same thing to set the servicing orders. If I look at the SQL tier, and these tabs will be true for any of the tiers. They'll contain more or less information depending on the purpose of the tier. I have my standard hardware configuration. I have my standard OS configuration with one exception. I could install roles and features if I choose to. In the SQL tier, I don't need any roles and features for the SQL server. Then my application configuration defines the type of applications that I'm going to deploy into this VM. Since this is my SQL server, I have 4 databases I'm installing. And after they're all done, I'm going to run a CMD file that I have in the VMM library to configure that tier. One thing you'll notice is these funny words that are in this parameter set that are appended and prepended by the @ symbol. These are how you specify configurable service settings that you want an end user to specify at deployment time. You wrap a friendly variable name. In this case, I've called it SQL Server Admin. I could have called it SQL space admin. I can call it whatever I want. I just begin it with an @ symbol and end it with an @ symbol. And we're going to extract those settings at deployment time and ask the user for values. And I'll show you how these get exposed when we go to the deployment, and also how you can specify default values for these and the properties of them. Like, are they mandatory? Are they encrypted? So we can use these in scripts. We can also, if I switch back real quick, I'll take that question. when we look at a package like a server-app V package, or if we look at a package like a web deploy package that actually has properties built in, for those of you that went to the server-app V talk earlier, they talked about deployment config XML, which captures the settings that are set when you're sequencing an application. So if I look at my application configuration tab here and pull up my SAV package, these are all the settings that happen to be in deployment config XML. So my service credential, I say, yeah, local system's fine, right? I don't want anyone mucking with that. The Windows service that was captured should always run as local system. However, I do need people to specify the SQL connection string. So I've said SQL computer name is a service setting. I've said the pet shop user name is a service setting that I want people to fill in. And when I go to the properties of this particular service template, I'll have a settings tab that will show me all the configurable service settings that I've defined based on my use of the friendly name @. And what I can do for any of those individual settings, first it will tell me every place that setting is used. So you see, the nice thing is we ask you for the mid computer name one time, but we actually use it to configure not only the web server tier, but also the SAV tier. So the user doesn't have to specify it twice, knowing it's the same exact computer name in all cases. And I can click on that properties of any of these settings, give it a friendly description so the end user knows what I'm asking for if my variable name isn't friendly enough. But I can also say it's a mandatory value and it's an encrypted value, which means I want it masked when the end user enters it, and I also want it encrypted in the service template and over the wire when we're doing our application deployment. And finally, I could provide a default value for them that they could choose to accept or override at deployment time. There's a question over here?
Yeah, I was just wondering if you already have an existing SQL cluster or SQL server that you want to deploy to, is that what you specified in the?
Yes, so what you would do in that case, so we talked about our application host support for SQL servers where we can deploy DAC packages to existing SQL servers, whether they're physical or virtual, whether they're managed by VMM or not. That's where the application host template comes into play. And if I add an application host template, the only application profiles I can choose, you'll notice I had a bunch of application profiles in my library. The only ones I'm presented with here in this dropdown are the ones that satisfy the requirements for an application host. And if you remember, it can only contain SQL database applications and it can only contain SQL scripts. So in this case, I have this sample database. So this could be deployed to a SQL server that I specify here. And the user could enter that here at deployment time again. So I want to deploy this one database, or it could be multiple databases. I could execute SQL scripts to an existing SQL server that's out in the environment. And we'll go ahead and take care of that at deployment time. The other thing I said that I would mention, was if I was creating a pattern that I wanted my other end users to be able to use as part of creating a new service template, I could mark the service template here where it says use this service template as a pattern for creating new templates. And then it would show up in that initial box that I had when I began the create service wizard. So what I'm going to do is take an existing pet shop service template that I have, and it looks just like the one I designed just now. I'm going to click deploy. And first I'm asked, what's the name of this particular instance? So is it Pet Shop Development? Is it Pet Shop Production? Is it Pet Shop Test? Right? What's the name of this service when it's deployed into the environment? So I'm just going to call mine Pet Shop Demo. And I can choose to deploy either to a host group or to a cloud that happens to be in my environment. I'll just choose all hosts. And now what's happening is we've begun our intelligent placement algorithm to figure out where is the best place, what are the best set of hosts based on what I've chosen on which to deploy the service, on which to deploy the VMs that make up this service. As you can see, this is going to have 3 VMs to begin with. So this service template had the web tier with a default instance count of 1, not of 2 or 4. So we're only going to deploy 1 initially, and we're actually chosen 2 different hosts. So 1 or 2 of these VMs are going on one host, and 1 or 2 of them are going on a different host because I chose to deploy to all hosts. If I deployed to a cloud, we'd use any of the hosts that back that cloud. Question?
Across VMware?
Yes, so great question. The question was across VMware as well. So any of the supported hypervisors Hyper-V, VMware, or Citrix Zen Server, everything that you see in this session is applicable to any of them. The hypervisor does not matter to us for service deployment.
And they all get the ratings, the same kind of star rating?
Absolutely. If you're an admin, if you're an end user, right, if you're a self-service user, you don't get to see any Fabric information. So you would, A, only be able to deploy to a cloud in VMM, and B, you wouldn't get back individual host ratings because we don't want to expose Fabric information to the self-service user. If they have access to multiple clouds, they could get different ratings for each cloud. So we'll just give them cloud ratings in that case, not individual host ratings.
Stephen, you went kind of fast with the drop-down when you selected all hosts. I wanted to see what other options there were.
Oh, okay, so I'll go back. Let me just finish this screen real quick. So you remember those configurable service settings that I showed in the service template? This is where they show up in the service settings page or tab window right over here. So I would be asked to provide, I didn't mark any of them mandatory in this template, but if I did, they would have a special icon indicating that they have to be filled out. So I would specify my pet shop user, my SQL Server admin password, what's the SQL Server computer name. So from here I can see it's going to be SBPS SQL quadruple 02. We support patterns for computer names in the template. So in this case, my pattern is SBPS SQL pound, 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 pound. Pound, 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 pound. And then we'll automatically generate computer names because we understand the names that have already been used. This question?
So you said that for VMware, it's just require the same, it'll work the same for service deployment. But what access, do I still need admin privileges on vCenter?
Yes, so the question is, do I still need admin privileges on vCenter? Whatever privileges you need to deploy VMs into that environment, we do still use vCenter, so you will have to connect to a vCenter, bring in your ESX hosts, and when you connect to vCenter, you're going to have to give us a credential that has some elevated privileges. I think we have an article that talked about the use of their delegated privileges instead of being a full admin. So whatever we support in terms of connecting to vCenter, that's what's required for service deployment. But there's nothing particular to an ESX host or a Citrix Zen server that means app deployment wouldn't work or GCEs wouldn't work. They work across all the supported hypervisors. Is there another question?
Can you split those up then, rather than all three instances going to, if you pick a host, you know?
Yes, so the question was, can I override placement settings and say, actually, I want to see if they'll all go on this one host, right? So I don't need them load balanced, I want them all on one physical host. Absolutely. So I can pick any of the machines here, and if I'm an admin, so if I'm a self-service user, I can't do that because I have no visibility to the hosts. But if I'm an admin, I can select a particular server, say web quadruple 07, I can see that it's on host 13, this is on host 12, this is host 12, so I also want to see if this one will fit on host 12. I simply do a select here. We're going to go out and calculate the ratings again for that VM, and we're going to give you the full list of hosts that happen to be in the environment. And you can see here that 12, although it only has 2 stars, it should work. So I can select 12, say OK. The diagram doesn't update here. That's a bug. That'll be fixed. But you can see that the host itself has been updated to 12 here. So if I went ahead and did the deployment, all 3 of these machines would go onto one host. So yeah, you can customize what we tell you we think is the best option. You can override us at any time.
And that algorithm's adjustable?
Yes. Yeah, so placement is configurable as a whole, and then you can always override our placement decisions. The only time you can't override is if we have a hard block where we're pretty much 100% sure that the VM will not start on this host for whatever reason. We'll tell you the reasons. We won't let you say, I think it's going to deploy, let me go ahead and click next. So we have different classes of errors in placement. We have warnings. We have reds, which give you 0 stars but are non-blocking. So that would be if I'm going to put my cluster into an overcommitted state, we don't want to block you. You're an admin. Maybe it's OK to put it in an overcommitted state. So we'll give you 0 stars. We'll tell you why we've given you 0 stars, but we won't block you. But if you're trying to deploy a VM that needs 2 gigs of memory, and there's only 1 gig of memory available, we're giving you 0 stars and we're blocking you because we know the machine won't start. So the other nice thing is, let's say I'm a user and I've gone through and I've created my service template and I've gone to deploy it, and it turns out that I'm not quite ready to deploy it yet, but I've done all my specialization, or maybe I went to deploy it into a cloud and for some reason one of my VMs couldn't be placed. Maybe my cloud was oversubscribed. Instead of having to start over from scratch, when I exit the deployment screen here, I can choose to save the deployment configuration object, which I'll do here, And then in the library, you'll see I have this pet shop demo SDC that I can then choose. Maybe I contact my admin and say, you know, I went to deploy this to the cloud, but one of the VMs couldn't be placed. It had a big red X, and my admin goes and finds out, oops, I oversubscribed a couple clouds. I better go put some more memory. You know, I better assign some more capacity to this cloud. The end user doesn't have to start over from scratch. They can go ahead, access this service deployment config in the library, right-click it and say deploy, and they're right back where they left over in the designer, including all the settings they may have configured, all the other customization they may have done. Now,
Is there a job associated with this?
yes, full job audit trail for everything that's going on in the VMM jobs view. So if I take that, there was one other question that I went through a drop-down quickly. So in the designer here, essentially if I go and configure deployment, I'm asked for what am I going to call this service? Right, so this is going to be my pet shop development service, my pet shop marketing proof of concept service, and then I choose the destination. And the destination is one of two things. If I'm an admin, I get the option to place to a host group or cloud. If I'm a self-service user, I would only have the option to place to clouds. Because again, self-service users in VMM 2012 don't see the underlying fabric. They don't see hosts, they don't see host groups. They see clouds that have been created by the admin, which are backed by host groups. But the SSU doesn't have to know anything about the fabric. So we abstract that all away and we don't show them any fabric information.
So in Concero, do you see all of that?
So Concero has their own deployment wizard, and you can choose cloud for deployment. You can pick an existing service template, and you still couldn't see fabric in Concero even if you were a VMM administrator logging into Concero as a Concero administrator. They don't pull back any fabric information from VMM. So instead of deploying this, because it's a 3-tier app with 3 VMs, it can take 20, 30 minutes to spin everything up. I do have some running ones. I showed you the IIS site, but in the VMM console, you can see my pet shop production service that I deployed has one mid-tier server, it has one SQL tier server, and I actually scaled out my web tier. So I have 2 different web servers running. It's web *002 and *004, and in my Internet Explorer, this is 4, and this is 2, and you can see they're identical, right? So they have the same application, same settings, and we also maintain all those settings for that instance so we understand which settings were used when that particular service was deployed. And we need that for when we're updating the service later. We don't want to always ask you for the settings. So if you've updated a package and you're applying that update, we're not going to ask you for, well, what was the SQL computer again? And what was the admin password again? We keep all that information stored securely. So if your update, again, is only a package update, we're not going to ask you for the settings. You always have the opportunity to modify the settings during an upgrade, though. So maybe in conjunction with deploying a new database, there is a new setting, or you have to reconfigure an existing setting. We always show you the current value of the setting for that instance and give you the opportunity to provide a new value for that setting. And we'll see that when I walk through the update demo in a little while. Question?
Seems, you've got 2 views, basically, end user, consumer view, and you've got your admin view.
Absolutely.
What's the major differentiator between why would you use this versus why would you use Concero?
Yep, great question. So why would you want Concero was the question. And I'll phrase it just as the question was asked, because I think we have a pretty compelling answer. We have a set of answers, actually. So one, Concero is a web portal. That's number one. So maybe I don't want to distribute a VMM admin console out to 50 self-service users, where I not only have to get it onto their computer, make sure they have the right memory requirements for it, but I have to update that admin console whenever we release a QFE. And maybe I just don't want the pain of distribution. Or the admin console isn't really a great solution over the internet, right? Because of the ports that are required. And you don't want to expose your VMM server to the internet. So maybe Concero is a better solution in that case. In the second place, lots of organizations wind up having multiple VMM servers. So I have one in pre-production and one in production. Concero actually allows me to register multiple VMM servers and not only see and manage all of my VMs and services across those multiple VMM servers in one web portal, it also allows me to transfer artifacts between them. So one of the demos that we'll cover later is we've introduced the notion of import and export for templates in VMM 2012. And optionally, at RTM time, you can include resources that back those templates. So Concero will give you a nice experience to move templates between systems or copy them between systems. And finally, if you're doing anything with Windows Azure or have any plans to do anything with Azure, Concero also allows you to register Azure subscriptions so you can manage not only your private cloud resources of VMs and services, but also your public cloud, in the Azure case, services that are running up there. And again, they'll give you the option to move things between Azure subscriptions, something that's not easily accomplished with the Azure Dev Portal today.
So if you're into pain, will you be able to, if you have multiple VMMs, export anyway from your dev VMM and import those?
Yes, absolutely. And we'll walk through a demo of that. So the update process. Talked about this a little bit. We'll just drill through for a minute. So I have my original service instance, which has a link, a reference to its service template from which it was deployed. What I do is I update my apps sort of outside of VMM. What I mean by that is I get a new version of a web deploy package, or I get a new version of my SAV package, or a new version of a particular database. I copy the service template, give it a new version, make my changes, and now I set the service instance to the updated template, and now it goes into a pending state unless I choose to apply the changes immediately. Now the instance is ready for update, so let's assume that I've said I need this update to occur in a maintenance window because it's going to be intrusive and it's going to require a reboot. Maybe I changed memory configuration or something. So I can set it to a pending state, come back later, and then choose to apply the update. And now we're going to go ahead, apply the update, make the changes that are required, and set the service back into a known good state, take it out of that pending state because the changes have been applied. So we have two types of updates that we support in VMM 2012. One is what we call regular or conventional, it's called in the UI. And this is when I'm updating a VM in place. So I'm applying a new package, a new configuration setting, and it's occurring on the actual running instance of that VM. The other type of update that we're introducing with 2012 is what we call image-based updating. And to be clear, this is for specific types of applications, and server app V packages are the first ones that come to mind. This is an application that's able to, it's aware of the state that it's persisting and where it's persisting it and how to back up and restore that state. So one of the benefits of server app V is that it does recognize the state that may be accrued by your application, and that state can be backed up and restored. So if we take an example of a blog application that writes its blog posts to a local XML file on the VM, server app V, when sequencing that app, will realize, oh, this XML file is changing. This is accruing state on that VM. When we have an application that can take advantage of that, that understands state and can back it up and restore it, what we can do is actually do image-based updating. So maybe I have a Server 2008 R2 image, and I use that image to deploy an instance of this blog engine application that was sequenced with server app V. And now SP1's rolled out for Server 2008 R2. And I create a new sysprepped image, base Server 2008 R2 with SP1. I can create a new service template, or a new version of this service template, right, version 2.0. I can modify the VHD that it's going to use, which is now my SP1 VHD. And when I update my running instance to the new version of the template, I could choose image-based updating. What happens with image-based updating is we're going to spin up a new VM using that new VHD. We're going to perform all the customizations that we would have performed. We're going to install the server app V application. But then what we're going to do is we're going to take the state from the existing running instance. We're going to save it. We're going to move it over to the new instance, restore the state. So essentially what I've done is I've updated the OS underneath my application. And my application has not had to take the brunt of me applying SP1 directly to it. And again, to be clear, it's for applications which are aware of their state, able to capture their state, and able to back up, transfer, and restore their state. And server app V is a prime candidate for this scenario. So I'll walk you real quick through the process we go through with conventional and image-based updating, and then I'll walk you through an update in the VMM UI. So you noticed when I was designing my service template and looking at the properties, I had not only a deployment order, but I also had a servicing order. So when we're doing an update to an app, to a service, we're going to select the tier based on the servicing order. We're going to select the machine based on any upgrade domains that have been specified by you. So if I had 4 instances and 2 upgrade domains, we're going to pick 2 machines out of that tier. We're going to remove them from the load balancer, if applicable. Again, GCEs are optional. So if you have any pre-install or pre-uninstall GCEs, we're going to go ahead and execute those. We're going to apply application level changes. We're going to apply any post-GCEs you have. If we need to uninstall and reinstall the application, we're going to take care of all of that, add it back to the load balancer, and we're done with that tier, or we'll move on to the next upgrade domain for that tier. That's conventional updating. It's a little bit different for image-based servicing. So image-based servicing, we're going to start out the same by selecting the tier, selecting the machine, removing it from the load balancer, but then we're going to add a data disk to the machine. We're now going to store the state, and we're going to take care of this in the case of Server App V automatically. If you have an application that can take advantage of this and you have a mechanism to store the state of that application, you can leverage the GCE to write your own custom script to back up the state of that app. So Server App V, again, we're going to handle this automatically, but we provide an extensibility point for you to do this for other applications. We're going to swap the OS disk, customize the new OS, reinstall the application again, whether it's the same package or a new package. Then we're going to restore the state. And if you've done this custom for your own custom application, again, we have an extensibility point for you to apply the application level state that you may have captured. We're going to add it back to the load balancer, and we're done. So I'm going to switch back to my demo machine. And what I'll do is open up my...
And that one you don't first reapply, restore the state, and then install that application?
So the question was, do we not first restore the state and then install the application? So the state is particular to the application. So in this case, it would be the XML files, for example, that we're storing the blog posts. So the application has to be there in its default form, and then we reapply the state. So we would install the application. By default, it probably has a 0 kilobyte XML file because it's a fresh install. And then we apply the state, meaning we're essentially, in this case, replacing that XML file with all of the posts that were stored in the instance, so that it looks exactly the same as the instance that we started out with. But we essentially have a fresh new instance on a brand new OS. But the application itself is the same. Absolutely.
However, the big caveat there is that the app itself is compatible with that, so it doesn't have any unique identifier inside it. In essence, it has to be able to be
Exactly. So if it was tied to a machine key, for example, that was specific to a machine, right? Not a good candidate for image-based updating, and that's why I caveated a couple times. Image-based updating, much like when we think about Azure apps, right? I can't just take some application that I wrote on premise and, I want to just deploy it to Azure, right? It requires a specific type of application. So we feel that image-based updating is definitely the future. It's definitely the way people are going to go. But we provide conventional because that's probably the reality for most applications today. So image-based updating, when you think about writing new applications, when you think about procuring new applications, that may be one of the factors you consider in terms of your evaluation. Would this application be a good candidate for image-based updating in the future? Or what type of development practices should I put in place inside of my organization to allow my applications in the future to take advantage of image-based updating? When we think back about virtualization, right, in the beginning, it was about abstracting the OS from the underlying hardware. And the example I like to use is hardware refresh cycles. Right? A lot of companies lease their hardware. And at the end of that lease, pre-virtualization, boy, there was a lot of activity going on, a lot of reinstalls of applications, database migrations. Virtualization pretty much solved that problem because when you did a hardware refresh on a host, you live migrated your virtual machines to a different host, maybe the new host that was just procured, and you sent the old host back. What we're doing with image-based servicing, what we're doing with application composition in VMM 2012 is we're taking the next logical step and we're finding solutions to abstract the OS from the application so that your application can now move between operating systems. When you have to update those operating systems, it doesn't have to be as intrusive as it is today.
So are you working with the OS team itself and ISVs to say, let's lock down the OS so you can't get machine specific anymore in future versions of Windows? So it would preclude a developer from even doing that?
Yeah, not that I'm aware of that we would ever try to preclude someone from doing that. Definitely putting out best practices for application development, best practices for taking advantage of these new features that we support. Absolutely. So I have this Pet Shop Service 1.0 service template, and I have a couple services deployed from it. And now my application developer, or I've downloaded a new version of the IIS site for Pet Shop. And I want to go ahead and apply that update out to some of my Pet Shop instances. So if I look in my VMs and services view, I'll go back to this Pet Shop production instance, and we see it's running on service template release 1.0. So I'm able to right-click that template and say, or right-click that service, and and say, I want a set template. And you'll recall when I first went into the library, I have a number of service templates in there. I probably have 30 or 40 of them, right, in different versions of different service templates. But when I click Browse, I'm only presented with Pet Shop Service 2.0. Why is that? Because we understand the lineage of the template that this instance references. So we're only going to show you precedents or antecedents of that instance's currently referenced service template. So in this case, the only one available is 2.0. So I go ahead and I choose the new template that I want to set to. And now, as I said, we stored the settings, the values for settings that were used during deployment time, so we understand them. I'm not going to change any settings here. I'm just actually installing a new version of the package. So I'll click Next. Here is where I could choose for each tier, do I want conventional or image-based servicing? Well, this is just an IIS app with web deploy. It's not really suitable for image-based servicing, so I'm going to stick with conventional. And this is where I have the option to say I want to apply the changes immediately, or I want to set it to a pending state and I'll apply them later. Since we're running through the demo, I'm going to apply it immediately. Click Next. Now we're figuring out all the other changes between version 1.0 and version 2.0 of this service template. And it turns out that the change is in my web tier, and I'm going from package WS08 to package WS08 v2. And I'm being warned that I didn't specify an upgrade domain, so there could be an outage because we're going to actually update all the machines in that tier at one time. And so I'm fine with that. I'm going to click Next. I'm going to click Finish. And now we have a job in the background. It's captured in the VMM jobs view, but we can see the status of it here. And this shouldn't take too long. So it's 33, 50, 2/3 done. The completed with info, it was with info, again, because of the upgrade domain. So it's just going to log a warning that, hey, there may have been an outage here, right, when I did the update. If I go back to my Pet Shop site, I'll start with server number 1 that's in that tier. I've gotten this new package. I've used VMM to deploy it. And boy, something wrong with the package, right? My image is upside down. There's this version 2 that really shouldn't be there at the top. And if I look at the second machine in that tier, it should look just like this one. I should have an upside down image and this version 2.0. So in the past, right, big pain in rolling back, right? Not too cool. I got to restart over. I got to follow my 164-page installation document again. But I mentioned earlier that we can not only go between or forward with service templates, we can also go back. So I want to quickly get my site back to the way it was, because it looked pretty good before with version 1.0. So I come back in, and again, I'm only given the choice of version 1.0 because it's the only other service template that has a lineage to the currently deployed services referenced template. So I'll choose 1.0. Again, I'm not going to modify any of the settings, but if I did, it would give me the opportunity to do that here. I'm going to do conventional updating. I'm going to apply them immediately again. Now I'm being told I'm going from version 2.0 to version v1. We've already seen that. I'll click Finish. We'll just keep a tab on the job status down here. What we're doing now is reverting that instance back to what it should have looked like for version 1.0. So we're 2/3 done, 99 done. If I go back to my web servers here, .NET will take a second to crank up, but I should be back to just the way I was. So how's that for easy rollback and easy roll forward? And just to prove it, I'll go to the other server and refresh it, and it's going to come back also. So there it is. Question?
I personally don't often get a seat at the application selection table. Is there a terminology or a certification, server app qualified? Is there something I could tell the powers that be, please shop for this?
Yeah, so actually we have Derek, I believe, in the audience from the Server App V team. I don't have the address of their blog, but they do a lot of posts on their blog. I think they target 2 a week or so, which details, hey, here are some things that are good for Server App V. Here's the components that we look for, the components we support, right, in Server App V. So that component list might be a good place to start. So we introduced a new refresher in VMM. So folks that are familiar with 2008, we have host refreshers and cluster refreshers. We have a service refresher now in 2012. And what this does is identify if any VMs have gone missing from the service. And it essentially supports 2 states at this point, which is OK, so all my VMs are OK, or needs attention. One of my VMs has a problem. Or if I have a tier that's fallen below its minimum count or exceeded its maximum count, we'll put that tier into a warning state as well. So at a service level, we support some actions that I can apply to a service, and it'll cascade down to all the virtual machines in that service. This is start, pause, resume, shut down, stop, and delete. Then there's things we support at a tier level, such as scale out. So So if I had a tier marked for scale out, I do that at the tier level. We have a new wizard for that, and I'll walk through that real shortly. And then there's certain things you still have to do to the individual VMs that are in the tiers. So this is if you have to migrate them. We don't have a notion of migrating an entire service, but you can migrate individual VMs that happen to be a part of a service, storing them to the library. In V1, in this release, I called it V1, but in 2012, we don't have the ability to store an entire service to the library in one shot. You could script that, right, by finding all the VMs in the service and storing them one by one. We just don't have it as a service level action. Similarly, for deploying virtual, we don't deploy a service from the library, but you can deploy individual virtual machines that you may have stored that were part of the service. Cloning, checkpoints, and then scaling in is not an automated action for us, because scale in is really a deletion of a VM, one or more VMs. And typically, when you're scaling in, there's a lot of other things that go into it, right? So it's not just about removing that VM from the load balancer. It's about removing it and probably watching connections drain off to some acceptable point before you actually destroy the VM. So you could script that. You could use our Ops Manager integration to do something around that. It's just not an automated action that we support in the UI in 2012, but scale out is. Oh, so if you want to checkpoint a VM, right? You want to take a snapshot. Sorry, a snapshot of a VM. We don't support a snapshot of a service. But again, you could script snapshotting each of the VMs that are part of a service if you wanted to. So when we deploy a service, we have this new Ops Manager integration. I'm going to just jump back in because I think it's easier to see there. I think most folks indicated that they have Ops Manager. So for this Pet Shop production service, I have Ops Manager running on a different server, but I installed the console here. And I can see here are all my services and what their state is. The reason we don't have state for these two is these are services that only use application hosts. And since we're not managing that SQL server, we just deployed the databases to it. We don't actually monitor the health of it, right? Because we don't necessarily have it under VMM management. But all my other services are. And if I go to my Pet Shop production service and right-click and open the diagram view, I get to see the service itself, each of the tiers, and the VMs that are in that tier. Now what I'm going to do, and I think we're getting close to time, but we should have time for this, is I'm going to take my web tier, and I'm going to run through the scale-out wizard for a couple reasons. One, I want to show you the scale-out wizard, and two, I want to show you how we update Ops Manager based on actions that are occurring in VMM. So the tier I'm going to scale out is my web tier. I'm going to let VMM pick a new name for me. I'm not going to fill it in. It's going to go through and say, hey, where should I place this VM? I got back my ratings. I'll accept the default rating or the default host that was chosen. I'm not going to customize any settings. You see it randomly, or not randomly, but it generated a new name for this VM based on the names it understands and the pattern that I used. Set some actions, and click the scale-out wizard.
Can you set up rules so that the VMs don't land on the same host?
Yes. So we have custom placement rules in VMM. We're not going to cover them in this session, but we do have the ability for you to specify rules like VM must match this, should not match this, and you can do some pretty fancy things there. So now, if I look at my VMM admin console, you can see this machine is stopped because it's just starting to be created. In the interest of time, this would usually just take a minute or two to push over into Ops Manager, but what I'm going to do is force the refresh, since we're getting close to time. So I'm going to write the Ops Manager connection from VMM. I'm going to go back to my Ops Manager diagram view. And again, the connection write will take hopefully not too long. When I refresh my diagram view, we'll just give it a couple seconds.
Since you're saying you're installing VMM agent now in the VMs, is there any special network connectivity or firewall requirements of the VMs themselves that are participating in all of this?
So we use for the data transfers and the data channel, it is 443 that we'll use for those, and then I believe that's the only port, but we have a full list of port requirements that we're going to be publishing. I think that's the only port. So my Ops Manager diagram died on me, but as you can see, that new server is there in the diagram. So before it crashed, it did show me that server.
Don't worry about it.
And that was Ops Manager, to be clear, so I just want to point that out. Now, the last thing I want to show real quickly, and then I'll take questions, and I'll be hanging around also, is the service template import and export. This works for VM templates also. So what I did was I created a service template in a different VMM system earlier, and I exported it. And what it is just an XML file. You see this is called Pet Shop Standalone over here. So if I go into my VMM admin console and I go into the library, we have this new action that will show up once I click on my library servers here. It's called import template. And I also have an export option when I'm selecting a template, in the UI. And if I go to import template, it's going to ask me, one, do I want to import any sensitive settings that happen to be in that template? Because when you export a template, you have an option to say export sensitive settings or not, and then we'll encrypt them inside the XML document. So I'm going to say, yeah, import the sensitive settings. I'm going to browse to my desktop. I see I have this document here, which is my service template. What's really nice is maybe in the environment that I authored this template in, maybe I used one VHD, or I used a logical network that was called dev, for example, right? And maybe in my target system into which I'm importing, I actually don't have that VHD, right? I have a different VHD that this service should use. Maybe I use standard in my dev environment, but I use enterprise in my production environment. Or maybe I have a dev network, a dev logical network in my development environment, but I need to use the corp network in my production environment. So for any of the settings, for any of the resources that we have, we allow you to either remove it or remap it during import. So in this case, maybe my Redmond network isn't available in this VMM system. I actually want this tier to map to the front-end network. Or maybe I didn't want to use this run as profile for this tier, right, in this environment. I actually want to use a different one, this DA run as profile, right? So maybe in my pre-production environment, I run as network service, but my service always must be run under a domain account in my production environment. So I can do that remapping here, click Next, import, and then what's going to happen is we're going to do the remapping, we're going to bring in all those settings, and this will show up in my service templates view. I believe it was Pet Shop standalone. So if I do, there it is. And you can see this standalone one. I wanted to show you really quickly just to reinforce the point that an application profile can contain multiple types of applications. I called this Pet Shop standalone because this is a single VM that's going to run the Pet Shop IIS site, the Pet Shop SAV package, 4 Pet Shop databases, and install SQL Server on it. A great POC all-in-one machine where I want to show off the power of Pet Shop, right? And I don't want it on a tiered environment. Let me switch back. I don't think we have any more slides that I haven't covered. So we have service template import export, which we just covered. And we did the demo. There's a little bit more related content. I want to thank you for bearing with me. I think we ran over just a tiny bit, but I hope you found the session useful. I'll be sticking around for questions. We can come up to the microphone and have questions as well. Please fill out an evaluation. Have a great rest of the tech ed, and please download the